Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to 1% Better, where we take a look at hidden stories in sport. I'm Xylon, and as always, I'm joined by Dr. David Lipman. Your medical question for you today is, what are the fastest muscles in the human body?
I don't even understand the question. The fastest muscles. I don't know. What do you mean?
I mean, it's English. It's simple English. What do you mean? What are the fastest muscles? Do you want the answer?
Muscles aren't fast inherently. Are you talking about fast twitch? Like which ones are the most fast twitch? Like have the most percentage of fast twitch fibers?
Okay, I'll give you the answer, then you tell me if the question makes sense. It is
Well, the question doesn't make sense, mate.
the eye muscles.
Okay. Yeah, I guess you dart around quickest with them. Yeah, I guess it kind of makes sense. It's a weird question because, like, the problem with fast
Because
is
you
like it's
don't know
hard to
it. It's
understand.
always a weird question when you don't know the answer. There's always a problem with a question when you don't know the answer.
That's rude. I'm hoping, like, listeners, write in and tell us if you thought that was a weird question, because it's like I don't understand how a muscle can be fast. I guess what it means there is like how quickly they respond. It's actually quite interesting how your eyes coordinate. So if you're doing this and following the pen, your eyes move together. So
Yeah.
there's like a nucleus. I can't remember what it's called, but basically it coordinates everything, because you basically, to turn your eye, you have to have two muscles, one relaxing and one contracting on each side of the eye, right? But they also have to coordinate between your eyes, or else you can go cross-eyed or outside. So it's a really cool system, particularly with, like, for instance, I'm looking at you and at the camera now, but I'm moving my head
Yeah.
and my eyes stay locked. Like,
Yeah.
that whole
Yeah.
mechanism is fascinating. It's unbelievable the way the body was designed.
The human body, man. Unbelievable. We've got a partner in this podcast, Precision Fuel and Hydration, the best in the business when it comes to sports nutrition. One of their sponsored athletes, 70.3 world champion, Gelachins. I never know how to say his name. How would you say it?
Yellow Haynes.
Gelachins. He's racing.
That's, to be fair though, that's a Dutch pronunciation, and the Belgians pronounce it differently. That's a much less guttural G for them. It's he's probably Yellow Haynes where he's from.
Well, he's racing Ironman Texas this weekend. And did you see he predicted his marathon time for the race?
Well, so I saw Pro Tri News put this out as a quote from Yellow's podcast, and, like, I don't know how true this is or whatever. I didn't go listen to it because I refuse to get bought into this. But here we are talking about it. But apparently he said he's going to run 2:25 in the marathon. Maybe that's what he needs to run. Maybe he was predicting a win and he thinks that you're going to need to run 2:25. I find it hard to believe that 2:25 is going to be done. I wouldn't be surprised seeing a sub 2:30, but I would be surprised seeing a 2:25. Like, that's basically, yeah, that is very quick. I don't see that necessarily happening in Texas for a few reasons, including part of it being the course.
What are some of the other reasons?
Time of the season, the fact that I think the bike will be pretty hard, and all those things. One thing we are seeing, and I was speaking on the, as listeners may know, I host the Norwegian Method podcast as well and talk to some of the triathletes in this race, right? The Christian Blumenfelds, Gustav Edens of the world. Something we were talking about, Christian, is kind of, it feels to me like the 20-meter draft rule. So this year, the Ironman now has a 20-meter draft rule rather than a 12. So there's less assistance from being in a group. It's changing the bike dynamics significantly, and people are probably, you would think what it means is that they are spending more power because they're getting less assistance. But what it's probably meaning is that people are behaving differently and probably pacing it a little bit better on the bike and blowing their legs up a little bit less, with the exception of a few examples. So then the run is actually a bit quicker and a bit more competitive. So it's interesting to see that. So I what I'm getting at here is I don't know if we will see it, but let's see. Like, my prediction is sub 2:30, certainly on the cards. Wouldn't surprise me if more than one person goes under 2:30. I'd be very surprised if we see a 2:25.
Okay, let's keep an eye on that. Really interested to see how it will go now. But if you want to be like Hela in the race, you'll see him taking Precision Fuel and Hydration. You can do so as well. And the good news is we've got a 15% discount on your first purchase. That discount code is BETTER2026. There's a link in the show notes down below as well, where you can have that applied immediately. And they've got a very cool function where you can book a call with them and for absolutely free with one of their experts, and they can help you on how to fuel your next big event. A link to booking, getting in their calendar is in the show notes down below as well. Can I get an update on how you're doing, man? What's happening with your running?
Good. Yeah, good. Running well. Feeling the vibes, enjoying it. Couple of reflections from the week. I took a pair of my treadmill shoes, and they're just the shoes I've been running on the treadmill in, and they've been feeling good on the treadmill. And I like how I feel running in them on the treadmill in terms of like my technique and stuff, and how poppy I feel. Took them outside last week. Horrible, absolutely horrible. And so my take from this today was that treadmill shoes are treadmill shoes, and they shouldn't go outside unless you have a woodway treadmill that like feels like the road basically. But really it's about shoe surface interaction, and they feel different. So my treadmill's got quite a bit of like cushioning, unfortunately, and so as a result, the shoes feel fine, but when you take them outside, they feel dead. And to be fair, I'm tracking it. We're going to talk about Stride in a second. I track my shoes on Stride. They've done 800 Ks, which is 500 miles. So they're probably dead. But I'm enjoying the way they feel. I'm enjoying that dead feel on the treadmill is kind of the point I'm getting at.
How did you
That was my
choose them
first.
for the treadmill? Are these specific treadmill shoes, or is it just
No.
a pair of shoes that you have that you chose as your treadmill shoes?
So now they are my treadmill shoes. They are not treadmill shoes per se. We did talk about that from Adidas. I think they released a pair of treadmill shoes. These are shoes I was doing intervals in before, and they've just maintained the shoes that, and I was doing a lot of intervals on the treadmill, and now they just kind of become my treadmill shoes for no reason, arbitrarily. So yeah, it's nothing special there. But the other reflection I had was we get really hung up on these different ways and means of training and doing all this stuff, and I've just taken an approach of just the real basic stuff. It's like really gradual progressive overload. So just adding a little bit each week. So if you look at my Strava and you look at that stuff, like it's just a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, and probably less than I want to do more each week. So this week today I did a half of an 8 kilometer run. It's roughly 8 kilometers, a little bit over 8 kilometers. It's 40 minutes, but I did last week. I started doing a slightly faster pace on some of those kilometers, and then I added a half kilometer this week. So that's it. 500 meters extra at a slightly higher pace. The minimum possible incremental increase, basically. And I just think there's a lot of value in that for some people, particularly if you've been dealing with injury for a while or you're still worried about injury. Is like, why don't we just regress back to just the smallest possible increase, way less than you want, to just build some consistency over time rather than like boom or bust type stuff.
You say time, man. That's the operative word. It requires patience, and it's so hard to achieve. And you and I were talking about this off air, how we know what the right thing is to do, but it's so hard to do. Like I've been very grumpy the last 24 hours because I've had the most nerve pain I've had since my spinal fusion 13 weeks ago, even though I just had an x-ray and the x-ray came back absolutely perfect. Everything's perfect. The bone's growing really well. We're on track. But I had nerve pain because I stupidly went to the gym 3 days in a row where I probably should have taken a rest day in between or just a walking day in between. And also one of those days at the gym, I got on the watt bike as well after the strength session. So that's too much load too quickly. Spoke to a chiropractor this morning and said, yeah, I wouldn't panic. Don't stress. Totally normal. You've probably just increased your load too much too soon. Now, I probably knew I was doing that when I was doing it. I was thinking about it, but I don't know why we keep doing the thing that we know we're not supposed to do. Like it's fascinating to me.
Yeah, and look, I think there's a statement that makes me feel better about myself often is like, to be old and wise, you have to have been young and stupid, which,
Mm.
it kind of tells you that you need to develop, you will develop a level of, let's call it wisdom by doing silly things like this, right? So I'm now super wise with how I incrementally increase my training because the cost of being injured to me is too high. So I'm so risk averse that it's ridiculous. I'm probably underdosing a lot of what I'm doing, but I'm also being very careful with it, trying to be very careful because I don't want a flare of this Achilles. So you kind of get to choose how you do it, right? You're welcome to go for boom or bust. You're welcome to go from 3 sessions to 5 sessions a week and see how you go and then be grumpy with your nerve pain. But if you don't want to be grumpy with the nerve pain, then it's really simple. How to do it is to be super risk averse with it.
Yeah, no, it's a good call, good shot. We are supported by Stride running power meters on this podcast. Did you see the post they put out around Boston Marathon and how to race it with Boston coming up?
So I'm not sure that they didn't steal this from me. I was talking to one of their staff members the other day. And gave him some advice because he's running Boston. Shout out to Angus, who's a member of our Strava group. And I said to him, mate, here's some thoughts on Boston. I gave him the standard advice I sort of give, and 3 of these things were part of it. which is, careful with the initial downhills because you plummet in the initial, I think it's 4 miles. It's like a lot of downhill. And for me as a trail runner, this isn't too bad, but many road runners will really struggle with the amount of pounding in the downhill. It's easy to get, it's easy to torch your legs so that you're in trouble later. And it's easy to run much faster than you want to be running because you don't have to actually put any effort in, right? Because it's downhill. So, and then, they sort of said steady over the hills, which I agree. You shouldn't be trying to push the pace over those hills. You need to sort of be, I would have an upper bound of where you're allowing your heart rate to be. So you're like, I'm not going to go over this amount, and you just slow down appropriately. And then you need to be in good shape over the hills, and then it's downhill from there. I think, and this was my strategy, was get to the top of that hill, because that hill's like, it's 37, 38 Ks, somewhere there, 36, 37. So like that's 20, I don't know, it's like 22 miles, something like that. Anyway, somewhere between 22 and 23 miles. The point is you've got this like 5 Ks, 3 miles or so into town with one little hill in it, but it's mostly a net downhill and then some flat. And it's actually it's probably the nicest last 5 Ks of a marathon I've ever had, because at the time where you're struggling most, it's actually the easiest running, or some of the easiest running, because you can maintain pace because you're going downhill. But you have to be in shape to be able to do that, because if your legs have eaten up already, you've got no hope there. So the goal for me was to get to the bottom of the hills in great shape, control over the hills, and then go from the top of the hills, the top of the fourth hill, and go from there. So it's exciting for those who are going out. The other piece of advice I give people all the time is go out and check out the hills. You can catch the train to the start of the hills and then run the hills and catch a tram back into town. It's like a 5K run. It's not too hard, if you don't run them crazy. So I would do that as well, because I reckon that really helps on race day to know what's coming.
Very cool post from Stride. They may or may not have appropriated that from you. If you'd like to check out Stride, like me, my Stride pods just arrived and I actually unboxed them this morning. Super cool. Can't wait to start using them. We do have a link down below. Go check them out. We got a few things to get through before we get to our amazing guest on this week's episode, Associate Professor Kim Hébert-Losier. I have no idea if that's how you say it, but it sounds French, man. It's good.
Not quite. It's close. She was okay with my pronunciation, so I'll take the win on that one. I'm not going to go again. So but she was lovely, great, really, really good researcher. We talked about her before with her placebo Supershoe research that we talked about. So one of my favorite papers of all time. So really great interview. Really appreciate Kim's time there. So stay tuned for that. But let's get to some community shout outs, mate. We had Jessica Copeland. Now, this was interesting to me. I was like going through our Strava group as I do, and I noticed she'd run the Coast Guard half marathon and she run 2:08. And I was like, oh, great. And then a little while later, I see she's run the Coast Guard 5K the day before, I was like, what? Oh, she did both, right? So she ran 2:08 in that half marathon and 25:54 in the 5K. So great work there, Jessica. Double up. We also had Barney Day, who got 15th at the Brighton Marathon, around 2:39, which apparently on a day that was quite hilly and windy. So, shout out to Barney. Congratulations. And then Phil Coleman had the Great Island Run 10K, and he ran 42:51. So that is flying from Phil. Great work. And then Josh Rochenkamp, I believe, ran the Hobart Marathon in 5:04. This is a hilly marathon. I was like, I think that's hilly. I remember it because I know Hobart. I've spent some time there. I went and checked it. So 494 meters of elevation.
Oh, that's right.
That is a lot for a road marathon. So great work there, Josh. That's really impressive.
Also, shout out to our chief meme officer, Spencer Lauderbeck, who puts together great memes for our Instagram account based off of what we discuss on every episode. He did the Corvallis half marathon, but he did one of those things where he ran it in 2 hours, 16 minutes, which is very slow for Spencer. Spencer's like doing Boston next week. He's a Boston marathon runner. But he called the title so-and-so half marathon with Heather, my wife, so that we all know it's not him who is slow, it's Heather who's slow. And I know Heather listens to this podcast sometimes, so we're going to get him into big, big trouble. But classic Strava move there.
Yeah, I thought you'd appreciate that one, mate. We also had Oscar Hjalmarsson, who was third at the Start Milan 10K with a PB of 32:36. So that is absolutely flying. And then previous guest, Emily Horgood, got second at Lake Sonoma 100K behind her teammate Fiona Pascal. So it's a great run from Emily. I think rounding into shape for Western States.
And then Spencer's getting some competition with his memes because I don't know if listeners saw this, but Pablo Almeida posted a hilarious meme on our Strava group of David running in his heat suit, and everyone just following them. We had a discussion on this a couple of episodes ago where I asked David if he's ever run outside in public with his heat suit. Brilliant display there. Thanks for that, Pablo. Also on our Strava group, 1% Better, Emmanuel Katsanis posted a photo with his wife mentioning that he's running faster at 70 years old than he was 5 years previously. Super, super cool, Emmanuel. So impressive. And also cool to see his wife wearing a Boston Marathon shirt in that photo. We also got a DM in from Helen based off of the Berlin Half Marathon we talked about a couple of episodes ago, where the pacer Dennis Kipkamoy, the 19-year-old, finished second, shocking everyone. Helen said, "Hi, maybe you already know by now, but in your last podcast, you were wondering about the pacer who later became second and got the chance to pace in Berlin after all. From what I understand in the German media, Emmanuel Petros brought him as a pacer. Petros trains in Kenya most of the time, and they train together over there. So he brought Dennis Kipkamoy over."
That made so much sense to me. I was like, there's no way Berlin knows this guy. There's no way he has a manager. So it makes sense that Amanal brought him across to do that.
We also got a comment in here by John Burchett Sharp. It said, lots to take on this weekend, but one point mentioned early in the show was, especially for older or injured runners, race the year you're in, live by it, and most of the time I'm not disappointed. Highs and lows, but it balances out. Really, really good from John. It's a good takeaway.
Yeah, I agree. And then we had Abalong comment on Spotify. And he said, "Hi, guys. Thanks for the shout out listening on my IDT Sunday morning as it rains bucket loads in," I don't even know how to say that, mate.
That's my town.
Sure. Yeah, great. That one. I'm going to sound effect for that. Anyway, I ended up listening to your pod twice on that afternoon training marathon, which, by the way, was meant to be a formal race, but due to reasons unknown to me, was relegated to a training run. Sounds like he's kind of salty about that. I particularly appreciated one of your last points about sporting potential and seeing early gains that plateau. I think this has resulted in many amateur endurance athletes quitting their sports. I'm not sure. I reckon that point of the initial gains is why people get involved in endurance sports, because it is, I wouldn't say linear, but it's almost guaranteed to see improvement. I think that's intoxicating. Right? The hardest thing, from diet culture, a good example is like when you're dieting, you don't see any weight change. Like that feels really hard. It's like I'm doing all this work and not seeing benefits. Whereas endurance training is kind of the opposite. You see gains and quite quickly, and then they definitely peter out. But I think that's also why people gravitate towards a marathon, because there's so much meat on the bone in how to improve in a marathon that I think it's intoxicating. And like a 5K where you can sort of fluctuate quite a bit and it's quite hard to run a PB. Like marathons, if you do a good training block, a lot of the time you're going to run a good race and perhaps PB it. So I think that's probably why we're seeing that.
Yeah, I love that. I remember my first ever marathon was actually inside an Ironman, and it was 5 hours. My PB now is 3:41, and I remember you saying to me, you believe I could run a sub 3 hour marathon. So before my back fell apart, I was fascinated by that, and I was keen to see how close I could get to that. Like just that. I think people who listen to this podcast, I think we're all the same in that we love getting better. We love getting gains. We love seeing how far we can push things. So it's just our makeup. You got an interesting text. We were talking about Hyrox a few weeks ago, and you got an interesting text based off of that discussion.
Yeah, I said to you at the time, the way to think about Hyrox is like think about half marathon times, right? Mm-hmm. That's kind of the throwaway like rule of thumb I sent you. And a colleague of mine, Dr. Louise Blair, sort of mentioned to me, and she said, she texted me and she said, "Hey, the mention of Hyrox times got me thinking. I'd assumed the top end times would be roughly in the same ballpark as a half marathon, but for general participants and such beginners, off the top of my head, I thought Hyrox would be a fair amount quicker. So I had a look at the data. She's a data person, so I love this. So I had a look at the data, and I thought I would share. Note groupings are a bit arbitrary, and I know less about half marathons to sense check. But so she basically sent through a bunch of times here, and I guess like it's kind of, I don't want to read them all because that's going to be terrible podcasting. But in essence, she sent through half marathons for men's and women's, and then the differences between them at different levels from beginner through to good, advanced, elite, amateur, pro, world class, and world record. So world record times for the women, 6 minutes 49 faster, Hyrox. And for the men, it's 4:38 faster. And then in the beginners, it's like 30 minutes faster for both of them, right? So basically, it's faster all the way along. Probably the least, like the biggest difference here, and this is where my thinking came, the smallest difference, sorry, was where there's pro world class. So there's only 3 minutes or so, or roughly the same at that elite level, but not professional, basically, for men's and women's there in Hyrox versus half marathoning. So it's quite interesting. I actually texted her back and said, that's at a group level, right? That's international groups. That's the top, say, top 10 or top 20. But I think within individuals would be a lot closer, right? If you had, if I went and did a half marathon and then I went and did a Hyrox, I reckon my time would be pretty similar. Now, she said, yeah, hers is very different, but she's also come from a more of a sort of strength sports background. And I wonder if you've come from a running background, it'd be a lot more similar there. And I also wonder if the difference in how big it is indicates different athlete types and where they need to work. So like for Louise, I'm convinced that the meat on the bone for her is running. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see. So I really appreciate that text message, Louise. I didn't tell her I was going to share this, so I hope she's okay with that, but we appreciate it.
Fascinating. And then we also got a question in from Steve Bullock asking about sweat lactate sensor.
Yeah, he sent something through to me. He said he saw it on Instagram. He said, "Oh, maybe it's interesting for the podcast." My take here is pretty simple. That's why I included it here. Is lactate is a concentration rather than a volumetric measure. So when we measure lactate in the blood or anywhere really, we measure the concentration. Right, it's however many millimolar. That doesn't say how much lactate is there. That says how much lactate there is per volume. Right, so per drop of sweat, there's that much lactate in it. Right, so we have no idea how much lactate we have in the body. Just how much is a concentration of the sweat. Now, the problem with that is a reduction in the amount of lactate or an increase in the amount of sweat, or not the amount of sweat. This is hard to explain, but basically, because sweat isn't consistent, you don't sweat at a consistent concentration because you'll sweat differently with different amounts of, say, like heat acclimation, etc. Because of that, your sweat isn't quite consistent. You end up with different concentrations of lactate in it. It becomes unreliable. The other way to think about this is what we're trying to understand is the lactate, as we understand at the moment, is in the blood, but that is a step removed from what's happening in the muscle. That is the net of what's happening in the muscle. That is a net of the creation and metabolism of it as a concentration in the blood. We're going to talk later about some comments that have been made about lactate this week and not producing it. But the point I'm making here is as we go further away from that, the less reliable it is. And we have to use these algorithms to try and estimate back what blood lactate would be, but it's not a good way of doing it. So I would say you're best off not using sweat because it changes so much and it changes so quickly. It's not something that changes over 6 months. It changes over 2 weeks. So it becomes very difficult there to really do it. And it's obviously, impacted by any number of other things. So I don't think sweat is a really good way to go. That's why I'm not that bullish on things like sweat glucose sensors, sweat lactate sensors. And I think interstitial fluid, where glucose sensors are now, and certainly where some of the lactate sensors are, I think is a better way to go.
Interesting, man. Thanks. And then we also got a question in from Spencer Lauderback, who we roasted earlier. He says, thanks for answering my question about niggles. It even made it into the title, which you were stoked about. I haven't finished the episode yet, but got to the part where you're saying that there are some shoe people coming to the podcast soon. One question I have is, what's the role socks play and how their attributes affect performance? For example, if I wear a heavily cushioned sock, am I losing energy? Great question.
It's a really good question. It's an astute insight. So the footwear people that are coming on are not going to be able to answer this, so I decided I'd jump in, Spencer. And socks is something I did quite a bit of, as a podiatrist as well. So I would say socks don't really help performance, and I don't think they can necessarily. There's some stuff maybe around aerodynamics, maybe if you're moving really quickly. There's certainly some stuff around, maybe muscle vibration. Like that stuff hasn't borne out to be that great. I was a compression sock wearer for a long time, and it's I've eased away from that. I'm less convinced of that, but maybe there's some stuff there from an injury, like maybe minor injury risk stuff, but I don't really think so. Point here is socks have definitely got the potential to ruin your race. They may not help it, but they definitely could ruin it.
Definitely.
And the biggest issue is being blisters, right? And our blisters are when basically the sock and the skin move in opposite directions. So you need a good sock skin interface, and you need that to deal well with fluid, because one of the reasons that they'll what was a good interface becomes a bad interface is fluid. That's sweat or water, right? So that's when you often get blisters there. So they can also change how your shoes fit. I don't think people understand this. They'll bring a certain pair of socks or not bring socks to a try on for a shoe, and then like they buy it, and then the shoe doesn't fit the same when all that happens. And then of course our feet can swell across an event. So I'd be very clear with how much space I have in my shoe based on the socks that I have, right? And make sure that you're happy there. So I generally would suggest the biggest thing here is don't use cotton socks. Like bless your cotton socks if you do, but also don't do it anymore. Use synthetic. It's much better. Generally, the way I go about it is I use thinner socks for racing, slightly thicker in general, and then I use the thicker socks I use are on trail because I find it to be more comfortable. I don't think there's cushioned socks. The difference between a cushioned sock and a non-cushioned sock is not much. I don't think you're losing much there, but technically, yes, if it can dissipate energy, yes, you will lose some there, but I don't think it's going to make that big a difference. I really think it's about preference, and I wouldn't be scared to try different types. And I wanted to give a shout out. I like this brand personally. I use In Silence, INCYLENC. It's a German brand, and I have no affiliation with them. I bought all my socks there, and I just love it. I love their branding, and I love the socks, and I've raced a bunch of them at different thicknesses. They have different thicknesses. I race in the ultra thins, and then I train in the slightly thicker ones. And I use a lot of Injinji socks, which are the toe socks. And I think they're pretty good if you're getting issues with nails or toes, like, interdigitally blisters or something like that. I think they're pretty good. And I prefer Injinjis on trail to anything else.
That's really good insight. Thank you. I never heard that before, how blisters come about. And it actually makes sense. And if I think about just normal cotton socks, and I think about my exercise socks and how different the materials and how different it fits, it makes complete sense. We need to get through a bunch of stuff here before we keep Kim waiting. Quick bits that has happened in the last few days or so. Paris Marathon. What happened there?
Yeah, so Paris Marathon happened. There's a few things have come up from Paris Marathon, basically, or like a few things happened in Paris Marathon. So people may or may not know Yemen Cripper. I keep an eye on him. He actually trains a lot with Amanal Petros. So Yemen is an Italian gent. So he ran 2:05. So only 10 seconds separated the top three. So the 2020 Los Angeles Marathon winner, Bailing Teshega, was second. And then Sila Kiptu was third. So that was crazy to see how close they were. Obviously a sprint finish. And then the women's was super fast. 2:18 for Shure Demiz, and Miskani Elemeyu was 2:19. And then Magdalene Masai was 2:19. So again, two really close races. Pretty fast day, actually. I mean, women, I think, slightly faster than men on average there. But yeah. And then fourth was Inatenesh. Geez, I'm not even. Anyway, the fourth lady was only 1 second behind the third lady. It's brutal. Brutal radio and brutal reading. Anyway.
Go on with your mate Jimmy Whelan. Much easier. Okay, to Jimmy.
So Jimmy paced a teammate, and I was interested in how he went here. He's obviously had a tough little patch here, but I mean, he basically ran 3-minute kilometers through the half marathon. And I think he went a bit further than that, because at 25Ks, his split was a 3:15 average. But then at 30Ks, it was a 5:51 average. So I think he slowed up for a little bit there, recovered for, say, 6Ks or something like that. And then his last two 5K splits, the 35K and the 40K splits, were 3:30s. He averaged 3:30 for 40 kilometers. So again, doing a lot of work towards his marathon later in the year. And of course, it's going to help his half marathon. So I was quite interested in that to see, how that went, and obviously did really well there, Jimmy. His teammate, Lucy Bartholomew, many would know Lucy. She's a pretty high-profile runner from Australia. She's a trail runner. She got out and bashed out a 2:41. So I was really impressed by that, really impressed by her speed. So I actually texted previous guest, Aitor Virube, about this. I said, mate, Lucy ran well. He said, yeah, she did really well. So that was cool to see. And then previous guest, Peter Tierney, ran. So Peter's not been training well. He's been sick. It's minimal running. And I mean, he ran 3:18 last year in Dublin on debut, and ran 3:25 in Paris off almost pretty minimal training, and, went out for a bit of fun. So yeah, I was just looking up his splits before. He was sort of 5-minute Ks or thereabouts for the first 10 Ks, then more like 4:45s through to 35Ks and then struggled again back at 5Ks. He said the last 10Ks was really hard. So that makes some sense there. And then I actually asked him about the water situations. They gave no cups away. And I actually asked him about this. So we're going to play some audio from him. I asked him to send us a voice note. And so we're going to play that audio now.
Yeah, I actually got a couple of messages on the water bottle situation or the water refilling. So one, the marathon gave out a refillable cup in the expo in the days before. So similar to how you would get one or bring one to a trail race, that kind of flexi cup. I didn't use that. I carried 2 bottles with me. Put one in the back of my run belt, 500ml, and then I carried another 500ml bottle. When I started the race, with about 800 mils of water, because the first bottle I had was I drank some prior to the race. I then chucked that mid-race to someone I know, just not planned, just wanted to get rid of it. And then the 500ml bottle that I kept in my run pack or belt, I refilled 3 times, probably to about 40 mils each time. It took all of 15 seconds, including slowing down, filling, and then kind of speeding back up. So, I mean, if you account for the fact that you have to slow down to grab a bottle anyway, it probably took less than 10 seconds to fill it. They had like tons of people at these sort of water stations, basically like pushing the tap or turning the tap, and you basically just hold your cup or water bottle underneath it, and they filled it up. It was really simple. So I think people made a bit of a stress about it before, but all in, it probably cost me 20 seconds in total, maybe tops 30 across the whole race. And I lost more time, to be honest, weaving in and out of people than I would have stopping to refill water. So yeah, to be honest, it wasn't a huge negative impact here, in my opinion.
And then also shout out to Brent Copeland, who ran the Paris Marathon. He did it in 4:01. Brent is, and I'm not sure he listens to this podcast, but he's the general manager of Jayco Lula Pro Cycling Team. And he does the Paris Marathon seemingly every year. Says as he gets older, he's just getting slower and slower. But nice to see Brent still running marathons.
That's a super weird flex, mate. Like telling me about your mate that works for that cycling company, but he doesn't really listen to the podcast, but we're going to shout him out, but we don't know. Does this mean you're going to try and get him to listen, or?
Exactly. I want someone to share this with Brent. If you know Brent, I think some of the Jayco Lula staff might listen to this podcast, or some of the athletes. So share it with Brent. And then we've had some announcements from athletes about upcoming races and various distances for things like Diamond Leagues. What are we talking here?
Yeah, so Listum Corsi, one of our very, very loyal listeners, DM'd me asking about Keely Hodgkinson. So Keely came out announcing she was going to run the 400 meters in an upcoming Diamond League. And he said, this is a bit weird for her, isn't it? And I sort of said, well, it actually makes a lot of sense because if we think about phenotypes of athletes, and we sort of talk about this a little bit, if you're an 800 meter runner, you can either be a kind of more 400 to 800 type of runner, Athing Mo being the other one of those, or you can be more 800, 1500 type of runner, right? So that's Georgia Hunter Bell, etc. Right. And so Keely's more the 4.8 type. So it does make sense for her to run a 400. And again, if she wants to run the world record, she's going to need to be faster. It's not necessarily about like slowing down less. It's about being able to be faster and be more comfortable there. So she's run 51.49 this year, but she actually ran a really fast split in the 4x4 at the recent Indoor World Champs, having run an 800 recently. So I think she's going to probably be looking to run 50 or maybe 49. At a push. And I mean, just for context, the world record is 47. And Sydney McLaughlin-Leveroni also went 47 last year. That's one of the oldest world records we have. It was an East German, very controversial world record. And Sydney McLaughlin-Leveroni went very close last year in the flat 4. So I don't think Keely's going near 47, but I think if she runs 50 or 49, she'll be happy. And I think that'd be good for her and her 800 upcoming season. We then had
Faith Kipyegon.
Yeah, so she announced that she's going to try and break her own world record at the Prefontaine Classic. This is a bit funny. So with the Diamond League, they have different sort of not all events have all events, let's put it that way, or not all Diamond Leagues have all events, particularly with, say, like the mile and the 1500. They're not going to have both. So they often will have, a mile or a 1500. And Prefontaine historically hasn't had a women's mile often. or if they have, she hasn't been running them. But anyway, this is happening on the weekend of the 3rd and 4th of July. So she's her world record is 4:07. She ran 4:06 in the sub 4 attempt last year. So actually, all that tech for 1 second wasn't particularly impressive. And I think we talked about at the time, I was probably more impressed with her 4:07 run than her 4:06. I've got a feeling here she's running 4:06, maybe even a little bit quicker, provided she's got either some good pacing or a good race on her hands. She's actually, though, fun stats, never lost at Hayward Field. And she broke the 1,500-meter world record there in 3:48 last year. And the stadium record is 4:21, which has stood since 1988. So, again, I don't think they run many women's miles there. I think they run the men's mile and the women's 1,500 there historically. So, yeah. And the last one, a bit of a weird one. Josh Kerr came out and said he wants to win a world marathon major. This was a bit funny. I've got a feeling this is... I think he's run a 63-minute half marathon. And I think that unless he's run a 59-minute half marathon, he shouldn't be really thinking about trying to win a world marathon major. I just don't think it's going to happen for him. I think this is more of a throwaway.
April Fools, are we sure? We're not getting caught out with April Fools again.
Well, it could be, but it was after April Fools. So I think what's happened is either the media have picked up a throwaway comment and run with it, or Josh is intentionally saying this to create hype around his 2:22 attempt that we talked about a few weeks ago to break the mile world record. And again, I think it was mostly just like, it'd be nice to do that one day. I'd love to win a world marathon major, which doesn't say I think I'm going to do it. Doesn't say I'm really going to try it. It just says it'd be nice. And I agree. It'd be really nice. I'd love to do it as well. It's just not going to happen for me. So maybe it's a compliment to him that people would even think this is a real comment, right? Because if you said that to me or I said that to you, like, it's like, whatever.
Would never repeat it even. Wouldn't even mention it to anyone.
Exactly.
You were following Marathon des Sables. What happened there?
Yeah, Marathon des Sables is a funny race. It's one of the hardest races in the world. So it translates to marathon on the sand, basically. It is a marathon in the Moroccan desert, historically dominated by Moroccan athletes, although Tom Evans did really well and podiumed there. But had a couple of relatively well-known runners running it that were not Moroccans that I'm going to talk about. So apologies to the winners and all that, and we should be talking about them to some degree, but also we don't know them, we can't follow their stories. But Des Linden, former Boston Marathon winner and now a high-profile person who's retired from professional marathoning, she was third and only by 4 hours, which is quite impressive given she'd never run more than 50 Ks and that 100-kilometer day through the sand.
Wow.
So, she did really well. But she's running Boston on Monday next week. So, and this only just finished. So she's got like an 8-day turnaround to get across the world and recover. So good luck. That's going to be a real struggle for her. She really struggled. On the long day, she did pretty well, but the day after the 100K, she really struggled. So historically, the longest day has been 87 Ks. This day was 100, but she really struggled with her abductors the next day, which makes sense. They're a stabilizing muscle and you're on the sand. And there's you're not going to go train on the sand, especially if you're Des. So this makes sense. I think she did really well. I was really impressed by it. Other people who are quite high profile, your mate, Ryan Sands, unsurprisingly didn't win.
David says my mate. I don't know him, but he's South African. That's why he's saying my mate.
He should have won, given his name, but he didn't. He was fifth there. So, that was really good effort from Ryan. But more impressive is probably Ludovic Pomeray, the French ultra runner. So he's been doing really well at UTMB the last few years. He was third by only about half an hour, but he's 50 years old. Wow. Ludo is an absolute animal. He's like the crowd favorite at UTMB because he's French, but also he's an old bloke getting around and it's just really impressive. It's just so good.
That is impressive, man. Should we get to Kim? We have time to touch on Paris-Roubaix.
Up to you, mate. What do you think?
Quickly, Paris-Roubaix Cobalt Classic happened. It's the monument that is the last one, I think, for Tadej Pogačar to win. And he came close in the men's race. He was second. Wout van Aert winning there. Wout obviously has had a really tough time the last couple of years with injuries and setbacks, and you could just see that emotion when he won. And you could see the sprint that he did there. That wasn't just training. That was belief and drawing on something much, much higher there. So, but what a crazy...
Okay, Kipchoge.
No, it's true. You could see he was still crying hours after he had crossed the line, and his whole family was crying. And
part of that was also he lost a teammate there a few years ago.
Exactly.
And that's why his celebration was pointing to the sky, because he was pointing up to his teammate and that. So there's a lot of emotion there. But emotion didn't win the women's race, mate. We're going to talk about that in a second. But I had an interesting observation here. So Tade was sort of off the back, right? And this happens a lot. This happened to Vanderpool. It happened to Vout. Like they all get flats or whatever. And he was off the back. But he's got like a bunch of cameras around him. And surely this helps him get to the front. Now, if you're a nobody, you get a very sticky bottle and get quickly made your way back to the front, to the peloton. But that kind of like doesn't have a lot of impact. Like I feel like Tade got quite a bit of help from like some drafting around some motorbikes. How does this sit with you? Is that a poor take, a poor observation, or you reckon this happens?
No, it's legitimate. The motorbikes, we've talked about it before, it definitely has an impact, and it's a big talking point in cycling at the moment. And him being the most high profile rider, he's always going to have a motorbike and a camera with him. He did have a bike change, and his team car couldn't get there because the cobbles are just so hard logistically to navigate for everyone. And the Shimano neutral service was there, so they gave him a bike, which is like just a Shimano branded bike. But I'm not sure if it's a Merida or if it's a Bianchi underneath there. But the point is, he was on some other bike that is not fitted to him, and he was very impressive on it for about 4Ks. Didn't lose that much time. So that would have impacted him, but definitely the motos have the ability to help him because they're obviously sitting in front of him and trying to film him. But even if they're 12 meters, 15 meters in front, you can get a drafting benefit from that.
Well, we talked about it with Ironman, right? They've changed the drafting rule there to 20 meters, and that's with a human, not a bike, right? Because a bike's going to be bigger and going to create more turbid air. But the other thing, this made me think of like other situations where you're disproportionately advantaged to be the best or elite. Marathons, right? Like, so for me, it doesn't make a difference. I'm never going to run, 2 whatever. But if you're like a 2:16 guy, in some marathons you get bottles, in some marathons you don't. That's a huge difference. To have your bottles on course versus having to carry your own stuff, it's completely different.
Yeah.
And so there's a real like delta there. You have to cross a big gap in performance with less for you before you're allowed to be given that stuff. It's quite an interesting observation there that I thought listeners might maybe not empathize with, but find the insights interesting. But I teased it before, mate. What happened in the women's race?
In the women's race, we had an outcome that we maybe did not expect with 10K to go, 5K to go. But shout out to Francie Koch. She was outnumbered 2-1 with 2 Visma riders, the GOAT, Marianne Vos, and Pauline Ferrand-Prévot, who won the race last year, also won the Tour de France Femme avec Zwift last year. So everyone just expected, including me, Mariana to win. Mariana's won something like 250 bike races in her life. You are expecting her to win in the sprint. But Francie is just in the form of her life. She's changed teams this year to FDJ, and full disclosure, I work for the agency that manages her. So super happy to see her win. I was so stoked to see her win, man. I met her once on top of Al's Angels in Girona on a bike ride with some mates who had flown over from South Africa with me, and I introduced her to them, and they all took photos with her. And when she won, those photos were circulating on all of the groups, man. We're like,
That's
we go
so
way
good.
back. All my mates were like, we go way back. The Paris-Roubaix winner, nah, man.
That's so funny.
Yeah, she's just so strong at the moment to win that sprint like that. She deserves it, man. I really wanted Mariana to win because she just lost her dad, and her dad has been at almost every bike race of his over the years. You always see him at the races, so she was really riding with his emotion, and you could see how emotional she was when she was second. She really wanted to win in his honor.
Well, I reckon you wanted her to win, so you don't have to do any work, mate. That's the message I got from you.
True.
But also, from probably, I don't know how far out it was, maybe 20, 30 Ks out, I text you and goes, Mariana wins this, doesn't she? And you responded, yeah. Because it was basically her teammate, Pauline Ferrand-Prévot, and Franzi, and you're like, well, they're just going to completely torch Franzi's legs here. And then Mariana has a procession to win this. And it just didn't happen. It was hilarious because they get to the velodrome and Pauline Ferrand-Prévot's there, and I'm like, what's she doing? And she looked like she didn't know what she was doing either. She's like, I don't know what I'm doing here. And I said to you, like, the only way I see that, she has no way to know what to do, really. It's not an experience she's had before. But the only way I can see her winning there is she goes off to try and sprint as early as possible. Franzi has to follow, and then Mariana can launch off the back of that. Because otherwise, my take was that Franzi was a better sprinter than Mariana. And I might be immature in my view there. I might be wrong, but that was my take. And then it seemed to be the case.
I wouldn't say that is usually the case. Mariana is an unbelievable sprinter. Has won many, many bunch sprints in her career. France is just so strong at the moment. But your point is really well made. Pauline Ferrand-Prévot is a climber. As I mentioned, she won the Tour de France. She's a cyclocross world champion, mountain bike world champion. She's won everything there is to win, but she's not a sprinter. She's probably hardly ever been in this situation in her life. So experience in that unique situation probably played a role. Last year, she won this race. She won it solo. She went off the front, got a gap, and once someone as strong as her is away. This year, she didn't seem as strong as last year, I must say, and that played into Francie's hands. Francie was just so strong. So even though Pauline was on the front and Mariana could just sit on and Pauline was doing a lot of the work, she was lacking that 5% where she could really burn Francie out, So, but Francie's in the form of her life, so.
It's also a good team environment at FDJ this year. Like, that's been very clear with Demi and all those things in her comments. So, like, it's a real concern come Tour de France because there's been a real leveling of the playing field, but actually maybe not. If that team's flying like it is and they've got the best cohesion, then like
cohesion's the word. They're working really, really well together. It's all good and well having top riders on your roster. You got to get them to work well together, and that's what's happening at FDJ. Before we get to our guest, quickly, is Gout Gout gonna break Usain Bolt's 200-meter world record someday?
I mean, if you're a betting man, you bet no, because like it's hard to do. But I mean, he ran really well, right? So there's some questions I've seen, from the American media, take what you want from that. Some of them are educated in that they're very smart sprinters about how many people ran well in that race, but it's also a national championship and it was a hot day at the track, which is good for sprinters. And, if one of them runs well and there's competition, then generally that brings out the best in it. So could I believe that there was something fishy that day with the timing for some reason? Okay, yeah, 5 guys running PBs, everyone running really fast. Yeah, okay, because there's another guy who went under 20 seconds, which is very surprising. But at the same time, with a 1.7 tailwind on a hot day at the track with good competition in a national final, and they were the prime time. They were the last event of the meet because of Gout Gout. So, like, does that surprise? Could that happen? Yeah, that could happen as well. So, I mean, he ran really well. It didn't look like he was running slowly. I watched it last night. I was like, yeah, he was flying. So, can he break it? It's foreseeable that he's a chance of breaking it, but for the same price, so could Arian Knighton, because Arian Knighton's closer than he is. No one's talking about Arian Knighton doing it because Arian Knighton's a little bit older, but the reality is there's no guarantees that Gout Gout runs faster. Now, there looks to be meat on the bone, which is to say he's certainly got some physical development to do. He certainly has many years coming, right? And he's still rounding out into physical maturity, but there's no guarantees you run faster as you age. We talked about this last week with Adam Gemelli. So, like, that may be the best he ever runs, and that doesn't make it a failure of a career. That makes him an unbelievable athlete.
Awesome. Let's see how he goes. Every time on my timeline, I see a video of him having raced and watch that race. It looks so exciting to me, man. It looks like we've got another Usain Bolt per se on our hands. Let's see. Okay, we've been teasing it for ages. I really enjoyed this chat, David. I had to listen to it earlier today that you had with Associate Professor Kim.
Associate Professor Kim Hébert-Losier is an expert in musculoskeletal lower extremity health and assessment, analysing how humans move to prevent injuries, enhance performance, and contribute to evidence-based practice. She's the postgraduate lead of the Master's Program for the University of Waikato's School of Sport and Human Movement and head of the Adams Centre for High Performance Biomechanics Research, acting as senior academic lead and liaison. Kim completed her Bachelor of Science in Physical Therapy at the University of Montreal with honours and PhD in physiotherapy at the University of Otago before completing postdocs at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and Mid-Sweden University. She was a forerunner in the use of 3D motion capture outdoors and is an internationally recognised contributor to the research in ACL injuries, screening for injury risk in sports, footwear, and running-related research. Additionally, she is the associate editor of Sports Biomechanics and has authored over 140 peer-reviewed publications herself, having been cited in excess of 4,000 times. Kim is a keen runner who has run 11 marathons, including Boston twice, and numerous shorter distances. She is also the developer of the Calf Raise app. She joins us today to discuss a recent paper she was a senior author on titled Economy Benefits of Running in Advanced Footwear Technology Shoes Remain with Plantarflexion Fatigue. And it's actually the second time we've talked about a research of yours on the podcast with one of my favorite ever studies authored by you, which was Are Supershoes a Super Placebo? A randomized crossover trial in female recreational runners. Kim, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Of course, we love having researchers on. We love shoes. The podcast loves shoes. The listeners love shoes. I love shoes. We love runners. I did want to start though. I did mention you're a runner. Tell us what's your marathon time? I mean, this is the question on everyone's lips.
Oh, well, my most recent marathon might be actually up to 12 now. I did a comeback after having 2 kids to marathon. In 2024, I was in Canada on a research leave, and it was always my dream to do the Niagara Falls Marathon, and it so happened it was on while I was there. And I did 3:17, awesome. Which is not too bad at my age and after having 2 kids. So I was pretty happy with that comeback.
That's amazing. It's actually a marathon that's on my bucket list as well. Where did you qualify for Boston, and when did you run Boston? Because I was looking for your times on Boston. I was deep in the research, looking through, and I couldn't find it. AI couldn't help me. I could not find your Boston times for the life of me.
Yeah, so Boston was actually the second marathon I ran in my life. So my first one, I think I was 17, and wow. I still remember I just crossed the finish line, and my time I think was 3:28, and the qualifying time was 3:30. And, for those who have never run a marathon, the first marathon is probably the most emotional. And I literally crossed the finish line, and there was this, silver-haired gentleman there. And I literally just gave him a big hug, started crying. And he's like, "Congratulations, you did it." I said, "No, you don't understand. This is my first marathon, and I qualified for Boston." And this guy had no idea. And I think I kissed him on the cheek and probably made his day. But it was, it was great. So my Boston marathon was, years ago. It wouldn't be there. To be fair, it was probably the marathons I enjoyed the least. I ran Boston twice and hated it twice because the first year was super hot. And the second time I did it, I was sick coming from Sweden in the middle of winter to hot. So it was terrible. But anyway, it was still quite a big experience.
Yeah, it's an amazing marathon. My co-host is not here, obviously. It's a bit early in the morning for him, but he'll listen back to this and laugh because he always jokes that I find a way to mention Boston all the time because I have such a strong affinity for it. But when you ran your most recent marathon, what marathon shoes did you wear?
Yeah, of course that was going to be a question. I wore one of the shoes from one of our studies. So I took a Nike Vaporfly, from the lab, because, I didn't want to buy some myself because I find they're expensive, but I did have some spares in the lab. So I did take them and ran in them. And I do feel that they, contributed to my performance. And obviously being in a running lab, I can test myself and I know that I'm a responder. So, so I did run in Supershoes.
Well, let's double click there. What do you think makes a responder?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot. I think we don't quite know yet, if I'm completely honest. So, and obviously some of my research has gone down in that direction. One of which is this recent paper that you kind of mentioned or talked about. In the sense of looking at whether plantarflexion strength or fatigue contribute to the economy response, because that was one of the factors that was raised by different researchers in terms of potentially contributing to Supershoe response. And contrary to our expectations, we basically found that calf muscle power, as well as fatiguing the calf muscles, didn't influence the magnitude of your responses to Supershoes. We're not quite sure yet. I do have another study in the pipeline that's just taking longer to get through the peer review process and make it out in the world, where we assessed a whole bunch of different metrics. And out of everything that we assessed, there was only 3 things or 4 things that came out that was potentially related to how people responded. One of them was navicular drop. As a former podiatrist, you'd appreciate that measure. So basically how much, your arch kind of collapses when you stand. Gear ratio around the ankle. So basically the lever length of your Achilles tendon in relation to where the ground reaction force is applied. It escapes me now, but plantarflexion strength, but opposite to what people have speculated. So actually those who had less strength tended to respond slightly better to Supershoes. And gastrocnemius medialis stiffness. So if you had a stiffer calf muscle, you actually tended to respond slightly better. So you get the scoop, David, because this is not even out in the stratosphere yet.
I was going to say that's amazing. I mean, some of that, I don't know, maybe it's revisionist history that makes sense to me. But if you, like, to me at least, what the shoes are doing is shifting work from the foot higher up, right? Because we can't really create or destroy force, but a lot of that's just being shifted higher up. So it makes sense to me that weaker people would do better. It also probably, if we look ecologically at the world, more people are running faster with less training and able to back up more. So that says to me, again, it's not about top end performance. Actually, it's probably raising the floor rather than lifting the ceiling, although it's doing both. And then similarly, with the navicular drop, just to confirm here, so was more or less drop associated with response?
More drop.
More drop. Interesting. So again, probably says to me, floppier foot, right? And therefore stiffening the foot with a plate probably helps. So fascinating stuff. I'm keen to read that paper as well. And maybe we have to have you back on to talk about that. But that's really interesting. So you're seeing some reasons there, not fatigue, which makes sense. And yeah, okay. And do you think there's a shoe? Sorry, yeah, carry on.
No, I was just going to say, and obviously you kind of mentioned about one of the other research that we did, because it was also a speculation that if you thought the shoe was going to help you, so the potential placebo effect of advanced footwear technology was something that had been raised also in more of I'm typically more biomechanics, but ventured a little bit towards this psychology aspect, where we did a study where we basically gave people 2 Supershoes. They were the same shoe, but one of them we spray painted black, and basically told participants that it was just a knockoff of the Supershoe, and basically got them to run in both shoes. And the running economy was exactly the same. Their biomechanics between the 2 shoes were exactly the same, which shouldn't have been surprising because it's the same shoe. But they love the actual Supershoe way more than the knockoff. So they were a lot more positive about the Supershoe, but that didn't actually translate to them having any improved in terms of economy benefits or changes in the running pattern. And to me, it kind of disproved, the fact that there was a potential placebo effect there, at least for running economy. And again, that, whether or not that would be the same in more of a performance or time trial time setting is still to be determined. But from an economy perspective, we didn't find an effect there.
Yeah, there's so much that comes to mind here. Like I'm steeped in Ben O'Nigg's work, and I've read his book, and there's lots of stuff he's done on looking at telling people as foams are harder or softer and how they land and hit them without any previous stuff. So there's certainly some stuff there that comes to mind, which makes sense in the same context as yours. Is how are people experiencing it? How stiffly are they hitting the ground? Those things. And then also we've actually got a researcher coming on. I actually record with her tonight our time. I don't know when we'll publish the episode, but she's doing a lot on profiling affect during things like VO2 max testing and looking at that. And she's got her PhD's co-funded with On. And I was actually a research participant for her looking at Supershoes on trail and the effect there. So there's quite some interesting stuff done on the sort of, let's call it psychobiology. So similar to some of your work, looking at comfort and pleasure running, which obviously is big for a shoe company, right? They want to increase pleasure running. So there's a lot in the space, which is really cool. Look, I mean, maybe we should take a step back. Like, what defines a super shoe? Like, what is a super shoe? How do we define it? And yeah, let's go from there.
Yeah, so there's not necessarily a consensus definition out there in terms of what defines a super shoe, but I think there's a generally agreed upon constitution of super shoe, which basically is a combination of, a highly compliant but resilient foam. So basically what that means is that it kind of compresses, but it also returns a lot of the energy that, is stored within the foam, which there's a lot of foam. So typically there'll be a high stack height or heel height. And then there's also typically an embedded stiff element within the midsole. And most of the time that might be in a curved geometry. So you might have a stiff carbon fiber plate, for example, embedded within the midsole. And holistically to the shoe within itself kind of has a rocker geometry as well. And all of this is packaged together and maintained in a relatively lightweight form. Because up until the super shoe, we know that one of the defining features of footwear that was associated with improved running economy, or if you want, using less oxygen or less less energy to run at a given speed was how heavy your shoe was, right? Because the more heavy a shoe is, and it's not rocket science, then you have to drag if you want your shoe and your foot more, so it costs you more energy to do that. So if you have a lighter shoe, then that's great. So now advanced footwear technology has these new features, but they still are able to maintain a lightweight.
Yeah, and interestingly, we're starting to see that swing back, right? Initially, the initial swing was don't worry about the weight, stack height's there. We're just going to pile stuff in this, and it'll be better for you. And now we're seeing that swing back with particularly Puma shoe, where they've used a contour-assisted design to cut some weight from that. So I do think we'll see a return to the pendulum will always swing, right? We're going to go away from purely maximal stack and purely weight into like a lower weight, maybe less height as a trade-off to try and improve this, particularly at the elite end. I think maybe that trickles down and maybe we see that. But I think if anything, we're starting to also see a digression in the consumer market from a sort of here's the top end shoe for the elites who have shoe regulations, and actually here's 60 millimeters for the rest of you, because it doesn't matter what you run in, and enjoy yourself and go have an experience and bounce along on a pair of stilts. So I think that's quite cool. But
but I mean, bounce along on a pair of stilts. I mean, there's also some consideration or some concerns there in terms of injury risk and instability. And obviously, we've also published a recent study which looked at it was a mixed method study where we actually interviewed people and asked them how they felt running in these different shoes. And you did have some of those positive perceptions from runners in terms of describing the footwear as bouncy and responsive. But then you also had people that felt differently about them, and they were concerned about the instability, the injury risk, particularly around the corners. Because again, if you put someone, to your point, on a very high stack height, like I wouldn't want to run in a 60 mil shoe. Like I'm an injury waiting to happen. So so again, there was some different responses, and some people didn't actually like that compliance of AFT shoes, and they felt like they were running in sand. Potentially that's an indication of whether or not they might respond favorably or not to super shoes, right? So if someone is feeling like they're running in sand, that can't be, if they don't feel super economical in them. But obvious research should be done.
I mean, I'm one of the people who prefers a firmer feel. I have a feeling that some of the people who prefer firmer feels probably have been running a little bit longer. I think the new runner wants, it's kind of like the Coke Pepsi test as well. I think everybody wants softness to put the foot in the shoe and they go, oh, that's really soft, that's nice. But actually, that might not be the case at 10 kilometers or 20 kilometers or 30 kilometers. And then similarly, I wonder if there's a component of the newer runner wants softer. And those of us who ran in horrible flat shoes remember what that was like, the old marathon flats. And there's some aspect of that we still crave. And we sort of feel like it's too soft at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a component of adaptation, right? So like... Again, like I like to give this example. I'm in New Zealand, and haven't been in Australia. Maybe you've kind of noticed this as well, but there's a lot more, particularly kids, but there's also, adults that go around, barefoot. My son goes to school without any shoes. He's 8. And he runs faster than me barefoot, because I'm like, I grew up in Canada, and where, we kind of wear shoes all year round. And like, I kid you not, he runs faster than I do. And I think, the skin adapt, the muscles adapt, the bones adapt, and so when you've adapted to a lower profile shoe or a stiffer shoe, then it is, it does feel different to go into something that has a high stack height. But on the flip side of that, we also know that footwear comfort is highly linked to footwear cushioning. So the more cushioning you put in a shoe, then you put it on, and to your point, you're feeling like, oh, this is nice and comfortable. You're kind of, on a pillow. And so, so if that's going to get you out the door, like I personally don't like big Hoka shoes and lots of stack height and cushioning, but that's my own personal bias. If it's going to get, Joe Blow off the couch and out running and doing some physical enhancing exercise, then go for gold, that's great. So I think there's been a lot of dichotomy, and there's a lot of very strongly perceived people. I have my own biases, but I also see the benefits of some of these extremes, right? And again, it's all about adaptation. So
yeah, I agree. I 100% agree. I actually find I spend some time in some barefoot shoes just walking around, and I find that helps readjust a comfort filter for me. So a shoe that might feel a bit stiff and a bit firm, I spend a day in those sort of barefoot shoes walking around, then come back. I'm like, geez, this is a nice soft shoe. So there's certainly, I think there's probably a chronic and a subacute and very acute effects here of periods of time. We talked about this off air a little bit. You bridge clinician and researcher really well, which is a cool thing. When you're thinking about super shoes and maybe taking more of a clinician's hat, how do you think about them in terms of these sort of subacute and chronic adaptations for a runner? So the example being like, I guess the simple question is like, how much time should we spend in these outside of racing? Either from a health perspective, an injury risk perspective, and then maybe from a race performance perspective, because those two things can differ at times.
Yeah, so that's the $1 million question at the moment, which everybody is asking in terms of adaptation. And I'd like to give a recipe, but in actual fact, like I can even think about different individuals or different people. Like I'm someone that responds quite acutely to biomechanical change. So I need a lot more time than, even the conventional what's reported in the literature to adapt to different things or to footwear. And I need to make changes progressively, or else I know that I am going to get a biomechanical injury. I know some other runners that, are a similar profile and built than me, and they can send a sponsor shoe the day before a marathon race and wear it for the whole marathon and not even think twice about, adapting to this new footwear. Now, I think in general, for most people, you do need a little bit of adaptation to get used to running in a super shoe, for example. So, only keeping a shoe for or purely for race day without having actually trained in it beforehand, not having done some of your potentially your interval runs in them, for example, I think you kind of miss the mark a little bit for most people. And again, it's a little bit of common sense in terms of that adaptation into your training. Do I think you should do all of your training in AFT? No. And again, one of my concerns is that, we do know that it shifts load away from the foot structures, from the Achilles tendon, from the calf muscle. And when you shift load away from structures, then they adapt to that lower load. So then wanting to go back to a more, if you want a standard or traditional running shoe where you don't get that added return, then obviously your calf muscles and your foot structures and those other structures then end up working harder. So it's kind of a little bit catch-22 because you get the benefits from, reduced work in the AFT shoe, but then if you do that chronically, then, you potentially adapt to that lower load, and then trying to go back to a more traditional shoe then causes problems. So I mean, I think there's a little bit of individualization, that goes within there. But then the other flip side to that, sorry to add another perspective here.
No, it's good.
Like for example, even for me, because there has been some research that has come out to suggest that the shoe wear AFT shoes and the benefits of the shoe decrease with shoe wear. Now, there's only been one study that I know of that has actually so far documented that. So they looked at, the AFT shoe in a fresh state, and once they had accumulated 450 kilometers of shoe wear in it. And initially, the AFT shoe was superior to the EVA shoe, but when it had been worn for 450 kilometers, then the two shoes were comparable. So if you use the same AFT shoe that you're doing your training in for your race, then actually you might have accumulated too much wear within that shoe to actually really get the benefits from that shoe in a race situation. So now we come to the dilemma that you're actually telling people, well, in really the best case scenario, you would actually have two shoes. You would have one shoe that's a training shoe, and then you would have one shoe that you use more for race. But then we get into discussions of sustainability and obviously of costs and affordability and, fairness, and which is another aspect of AFT that's not often talked about, but it is something that kind of concerns me.
Yeah, I mean, there's a concern at the youth level, right? So all this stuff we're talking about adults, but if you scale that to youth, now we're talking about how well are you developing physically? You were talking about your son being barefoot, which I love. So what does it look like if he starts running in AFTs? What if everybody else is running in them and he's not? What if you can't afford them? What if you don't want him in them? Is there a performance benefit that he's missing? In both ways, right? So it's like, we probably grew up being told, hey, don't use a calculator. You may not always have one, which has turned out to, age like milk. But, so don't always use AFTs because it may not be the best thing for your foot. It's like, well, actually, if that's what he's going to race in for the rest of his life, maybe adapting to them more is a better thing. We don't know, right? So it's so hard. I disagree with that take, but like I can appreciate that someone may say this is going to be the computer or the calculator of his life going forward. So it's hard to understand.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's the same thing with, use of AI in education at the moment, or, however we want to think about that. And yeah, there's heaps of benefits in terms of AI use and productivity and enhancing learning, but being just used to kind of pass assessment. And, we know that it doesn't help to develop critical thinking in youth. So is that actually like we want them to be competent and be able to use those tools. And a lot of them are better than we are, which is great. But then at the same time, they become reliant on AI and not necessarily learn the basic concepts. So, it's a little bit the same thing. Well, the same thing.
Yeah.
We're talking AFT and AI, but,
I think it's a well-made point because you do need to be able to use it, but do you want to be reliant on it? Do you want it to be a crutch so that, if for some reason you don't have it, it's a problem, right? So listen, shoes are viewed this way to some degree at some point. Or, Bill Bauman famously said that, if a shoe made it past the finish line, it was, it should make it one step past the finish line. So there's certainly a changing view on this. And, we both live probably through, as clinicians, the barefoot running craze, and there's certainly some merit in it, right? We were talking about your son being barefoot and the benefits of that, and I think there is some, right? So some time barefoot, some stimulation of those muscles, and we're going to get to the calf app in a second. So those things are valuable, right? Just like going to the gym to strengthen your muscles is valuable, like spending some time barefoot to strengthen those muscles is valuable. It's just how we do that, right? How are we deciding to load the feet and the ankle and the calf, and how does that fit into a day? Because one of the challenges, and I say this often on the podcast, with the foot and the legs in general compared to say a shoulder, is we can't really deload it from the load of life. If I put you in a sling, we can deload your shoulder quite well. It's really hard for us to do that at the foot and ankle. So you have these conflicting or differing loads that you have to consider, and one is very hard to quantify. If I say 4 by 100 meters barefoot, that's very easy to quantify, but I don't know what you're doing walking around in the day, right? I was away over the weekend, walked a lot. My Achilles wasn't as happy. Like, you can't quantify that. I just did more steps. So it becomes hard, but I think we're getting there. I wanted to touch on something quickly. You mentioned before the gear ratio of the Achilles. Do you think the gear ratio impacts where people respond or how they respond to different rocker positions? Or do you think the rocker position changes the gear ratio, for the advantage?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would think from a biomechanical perspective, it does make sense that, even just different foot shapes and morphology might respond differently. One of the aspects that hasn't necessarily been looked into in depth, which we're starting to look into our lab here in collaboration with Salomon, is actually the influence of even just different footwear length. Because a lot of the time, when you see the stiffness measurements, for example, reported in the literature, it's for one size of footwear, but we actually don't know how that really in detail how that scales. And there has been some research that has looked at, okay, well, do females respond better than males? And some research say no, some research say yes, and it could be a scaling. A scaling feature as well that hasn't necessarily been looked into. Because if you're putting a carbon fiber plate on, this much versus this much, and then, similarly with the amount of foam that's within the shoe, then it's not proportional. But we actually don't really have any information out there to tell us, is it a 10% difference, 5% difference? How does that actually influence? We don't actually really know. And maybe the people inside, I don't know, Nikes and Adidas and all that, they have all this information, but doesn't reach people like yourself and me. So we just end up doing those studies anyways.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good point. It's something I used to think about a lot in podiatry when we'd often talk about, and in shoes, we talk about the drop, right? What's the difference between the heel and the toe? And that gives a rough angle, right? But that's different in different shoe sizes, right? So like a heel to toe drop of 10 millimeters over say a size 6 is different to a size 12, right? Because that angle is completely different if we have the same offset, right? So
Yeah,
there's a lot of stuff.
Thing with footwear and kids, right? Because if we're talking
Yep.
about kids, and you're putting a kid in a shoe with a heel height of 20 mils, they're like standing on stilettos, and it's like, well, do we really want to do that with a developing foot? And my kind of personal viewpoint is no. But that 20 mil on a foot that's that big is not the same as a 20 mil on an adult level foot. So yeah, I know we're talking about AFT, but like footwear in children is another kind of growing area of interest and passion of mine. And I think obviously being here in New Zealand has kind of helped to develop that, passion. But it's very interesting topics.
Yeah, I love that. Well, let's get onto this because that all revolves around foot strength, right? And one of the things we thankfully have seen in the research is that generally foot strength and intrinsic muscle activity can be well stimulated with a calf raise and similar. Maybe it's not perfect, but it's a good stimulation. And when we think about, I guess, scientific accuracy versus advocacy, I think we probably both agree, like from an advocacy and a clinical utility point of view, telling someone, listen, it's good enough to do calf raises. You don't have to worry about all of the other little things unless there's a pathology, I think is a nice way to do it. So let's start off with the simple question that you get asked all the time and basically debunked as a question, but how many calf raises should runners be able to do?
Yep. And again, interestingly enough, there's not really strong evidence on just a running-based population. And, we did do a study recently with obviously being in New Zealand, being, with rugby players and anticipating them to potentially do, say, more calf raises than would your general population. And actually what we found is that they tended to kind of perform similarly to your general population. Now, obviously, they kind of tend to have more mass. So then, if you look at the total amount of work, that mechanical work that they're actually doing, more work, but they also need to be powerful. So if you're just talking about calf raise, repetitive calf raise looks at strength endurance, but that's only one component of calf function, because you do have your strength and endurance component, but then you have your maximal strength, and then you have your power abilities. And, if you spend a lot of time developing your power abilities, then actually that at some point that might come and compromise your strength abilities. So, it's kind of having that, that balance in those abilities. But yeah, I mean, to come back to your questions about runners and how many calf raises should they do, runners generally think that they have strong calf because they run. And actually, a lot of them, if you go and assess their calf strength, they're actually relatively poor. And I think most runners could actually benefit, and including myself, of doing calf raises and supplement to running, because it doesn't actually develop. And, if you think when you're running, you don't actually go through the full range of motion of your ankle. So if you're not going through the full range of motion of your ankle, you're not actually developing that strength through that full range of motion. And a lot of the times your muscles are also primarily working, in a kind of isometric type format. Whereas if you actually stop and purposely work on your calf raises, then you're kind of going into that concentric, eccentric loading of the calf muscles. So, so I think runners think that they can do more than they actually can. And if you actually test them, they're actually fairly weak in their calf muscles. Yeah.
Well, I did want to ask you about this because it's a bit of a technical question. So apologies to listeners, but this is something that interested me, and so this is one for me. So a lot of your work, and you just mentioned some of it, talking about effectively mechanical work, which is displacement. So how far does it move times the number of repetitions times body weight, right? That's effectively what we're talking about here. So some of your other work and the calf raise app work has looked at this, and basically it looks like it's not about the number because it's about the total work that's being able to be done. And that seems to be consistent. You just mentioned it in rugby players. If that's the case, are we really just looking at the load capacity of, say, the muscular tendinous unit? And given tendons are more similar in humans than they are different, right? Even in your big front rowers who are 130 kilos, their tendon probably looks pretty similar to mine compared to their calf. Are we really just seeing something to do with, I guess, that? I don't know what I'm trying to ask here, but that was when I was reading it, that came to mind, is particularly in running, as you just mentioned, it's so much isometric work. So really we're talking about effectively tendon work more than we are in running versus, say, calf work. Is that fair? Is that a fair, my line of thinking right off there, or is it somewhere down the line that seems reasonable?
I mean, I think it's a combination of the triceps or a muscle tendon unit capacity. So, to say that it's primarily tendon capacity, I think would be remiss, because, you do need a muscle contraction, and we do see that the muscles become active.
Yep.
Like my PhD work was looking at calf muscle activity and fatigue during calf raises in a knee straight and a knee bent position. And, you do see muscle activity of the soleus and the gastrocs, and you do see that they fatigue during the course of this test. So you do have some activation of your calf muscles, but yeah, definitely the tendon is involved within that process as well. And we know that from, Karen Silbernagel's work in the US, which, she was really the one to kind of first push forward this concept of work is superior than just looking at the number of repetitions. And again, it makes sense, because you can have someone that, rises just, 5 centimeters off the ground and complete, 20 repetitions, versus someone that actually does a high calf raise and raises 10 to 12 centimeters off the ground and do 20, calf raises. So in essence, they're doubling their amount of displacement. So they're doubling their amount of work. So, if you're half-assing calf raises, and you do 20, well, that's actually not necessarily a fair reflection. So that's where your mechanical work becomes really interesting, kind of to look at. Yeah. And then, post Achilles tendon ruptures, we know that if there's slack in the Achilles tendon, then that's where you have a decrease in your peak height. So how high you can go during the calf raise. So even though you can potentially complete the same amount of number of repetitions, well, you're actually, because you have tendon slack, you can't actually go through the full range of motion. So then your mechanical work is reduced and your peak height is reduced in that sense.
Yeah, geez, I wouldn't want to be a surgeon doing that, because if you do it too tight, then you can't get the dorsiflexion either, which is a huge injury risk. So, yeah, what a absolute headache for them. They seem to do pretty well though. But so back to the calf raises then. How do we do them? So should we be hanging off a step into dorsiflexion, nice and controlled, or how do we do this?
Well, it depends what you're targeting. So
let's say for runners.
Yeah. So we have a few kind of research out there. One of them that we recently kind of published was looking at that variation between doing calf raises from the ground versus from a 10-degree incline versus from a step. And my personal preference is to do it from an incline. And namely because when you have an incline, individuals do come all the way back down. Now, if you're letting people just hover from the step, really what happens is that even though you might tell them to go through the full range of motion, they tend not to dip and bring their heel, down to kind of get through to that ankle dorsiflexion. Whereas if you put them on an incline, then actually it gives them an endpoint for them to then kind of come back to. So if you are doing on a step, you just have to be really mindful that you do want people to kind of go through, through that range of motion. And then people do tend to do a greater amount of work from the incline than they do just from hovering is what we found. So that's my personal preference. But again, it depends where you are in your rehabilitation pathway, right? Because if you're just someone that has a current injury and, say it's an Achilles tendinopathy and it gets worse when you go into dorsiflexion, then yeah, you want to do it, potentially start from the floor, because then you're just going to, make it angry. And then you're going to say, oh, well, Kim told me to do this. And then I'm going to get a nasty email. So again, it depends on what you're using calf raises for. If you're kind of uninjured and you're just looking at increasing your calf capacity, my personal preference is doing it with an incline. But not everybody just has a 10-degree incline hanging around. So yeah, then at the end of the day, increasing the range of motion so that it's functional, to me, it makes more sense. So then my next preference would probably be from a step.
Yeah. So for the listeners who aren't watching, I raised my hand during that because that is my Achilles at the moment. I found that I've started to not use a step, but use some weight plates, and then using to your point, maintaining range can be a challenge. But if I'm using the right amount of plate, what I can find is that I can actually touch the ground. So I do have a stimulus there of like, that is a full rep. And if you miss one, you miss one, right? So I think maybe that's a solution for people if they are using a step, is have something there that says this is enough, right? So this is the bottom, so you can then touch back up. So it's a bit
absolutely.
more of a setup, and done is better than planned, and good is better than perfect, but or done is better than perfect. So let's keep the advocacy thing, do your calf raises, but preferably you need to maintain range.
Yeah, and
I
then
think is the thing.
something that we're working on as well is how does variation in cadence and pace influence how people perform this task. So, for example, in the Australian ballet or in ballet in general, they tend to use slower cadence and tempos to do their calf raises because obviously they have a little bit more of isometric work and slow and being on point and everything else. While typically your standard would be 30 full repetitions per minute. But you can also do it faster. So then again, like it kind of comes back to where are you in your rehab pathway, or what are you trying to target? And then recently we've also just investigated, well, if you just let people self-select a cadence, what do they normally gravitate to? Because we all do it at 60 beats per minute in a clinical setting. That basically kind of came out of nowhere. It was just kind of like, oh, someone someday decided, oh, that's close to walking velocity for which again, not actually comparing it to walking velocity, and just set the calf raise to 60 beats per minute. And then everybody's just been doing 60 beats per minute since like the 1980s. And I'm like, well, yeah, okay, seems good, but is it the best? Like we actually don't know. So cadence is another interesting one.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, just do calf raises and you'll be sweet.
Yeah, pretty much. And don't bounce too much. Don't use too much tendon. Right, so keep them controlled on the way down. Let's put it that way.
Well, unless you want to develop your tendon capacity. So again, I think it kind of depends, because then if you want to work on your shortening cycle capacity and you're looking to return to sport, for example, that does require change of directions or things like that, then actually you might be wanting to do them super fast. But if you want to develop your muscle capacity, then yeah, definitely don't do them too fast.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you've done some research on how runners pick running shoes. This fascinates me. How do you think they pick running shoes, or how do they pick running shoes? What did your research show?
So you talk to people on the street and they'll say, oh, color. And of course you do research on it and nobody actually picks color. So, most people, obviously their guiding principle is comfort. So, they want a shoe that they feel comfortable. They tend to want to pick a shoe that will decrease their injury risk. So they tend to prioritize injury reduction over, say, performance enhancement. But typically, it will be comfort, injury considerations, and then performance. In the study that we did with, Dr. Andrew Fife, another important consideration for people was they said gait analysis. I think that was primarily because the study that we originally ran with him was primarily based out of the US, and in the US they do a lot of in-store, gait analysis. There is a bit of that here in New Zealand. I wouldn't say it's necessarily mainstream. But being from North America myself, I can say that, a lot of the times, you kind of go in a shoe shop and they'll put your shoe, get you to do a few movements to get on the treadmills, and then, tell you what shoe you need. So gait analysis came up as being one of the driving factors that helped them select footwear, which, again, to me, being a clinician in biomechanics, knowing that people respond differently to footwear, knowing that what the foot is doing inside the shoe is not necessarily what you're seeing outside the shoe, I was like, well, should that really be our deciding factor? And again, going into that kind of perception of footwear, we did a study here in the lab where we did a sham gait analysis. And we did, we pretended to take, foot posture. We looked at the way people squatted. We looked at how they walked. We looked at how they ran. And then based on our observations, we recommended them a shoe that we had in the lab. And we said, okay, based on, your foot type and the way you move, this is the shoe for you. And then we had them a control shoe, which was basically the same shoe, just in a different color. And we said, oh, this is just, a neutral shoe. It's good for running, but it's not specifically made for you. And they're like, okay, sweet. And once again, we got them to run on the treadmill, spatial temporal. So, your kind of step length, gait characteristics were exactly the same in the two shoes. But they highly preferred the one that was recommended to them. even though it was exactly the same shoe. So they thought it was more comfortable. They thought it would reduce their injury risk. They thought it would increase their performance. And, they liked it. A lot of them liked it even more than their own running shoe that they brought into the lab, that they had previously selected themselves, just because we recommended it to them, which again, to me, has a lot of practical and clinical implication, right? So just because you're telling someone that you think this is the shoe for them, then they're more likely to find it comfortable. And, I know Ben Onig's comfort filter has a lot of, kudos and gravitas. And I obviously kind of respect Ben Onig and his research highly. But the one thing that really bothers me about the comfort filter is that comfort is highly manipulable. And if we're using that as our parameter for footwear selection, and again, like we said before, if you find a comfortable footwear, it's going to get you out the door and do some running, great. If you're not injured, great. If you don't want to improve your performance, great. Then use comfort. That's completely fine. But as a clinician, if you have an injury, well, is the most comfortable footwear really going to help you solve your issues? Well, maybe not. Maybe that's not actually the best indicator of, what would be good for you. If, a footwear that's not necessarily 100% comfortable can still enhance your performance. I'm not saying take a footwear that you hate. And obviously, pain is there for a reason. But, so I think there's some nuance there that often we don't consider. And it's a throwaway to just say, oh yeah, choose the shoe that you feel is the most comfortable. Yes, but it depends, again, what you want to use that shoe for. It depends what your goals are. It depends if you're injured. So I think there's a lot of things that kind of depend in that equation.
Yeah, and like comfort's funny. We talked about it before. I mentioned it earlier. Like, what is comfortable? You put your foot in the shoe. Like, generally, and I worked specialty retail. I did gait analysis in specialty retail. I did all this stuff, both as a clinician and when I was going through medical school. And the power of suggestibility is 100% real. Like it was so clear to me that you could bias people, and for better or for worse. But generally, when you put a shoe on, what you feel is comfortable is to do with maybe the way the shoe fits on your foot, which is a very relevant factor. You don't want a shoe that doesn't fit. There's no question about that. And how nice and plush the upper is, and then how soft it feels inside. And none of those things are about comfortability when you're running. They have some relation, but not a lot, right? And again, when you're running at what speed, for how long, we do gait analysis on a treadmill. Is that representative of outdoor running? The answer is probably not. When it comes to comfort, particularly depending on the treadmill, maybe a Woodway treadmill, it feels a bit more like outside, but a lot of these treadmills that are very cushioned and have a lot of these air things, that doesn't feel like bitumen. Like that isn't the same. So there's a lot here.
No, absolutely. And in that study that we talked about earlier, where we actually kind of did a mixed method study and asked people about shoe, we purposely designed it so that they had the opportunity to first look at the shoe and say, and feel it. And, do you think you're going to like it? Would you buy it? And then we actually got them to put it on and do what you do in a running store, right? Just bounce around, run around a little bit. And then they gave us a rating. And then we actually got them to run in the shoe, and they ran, 1.5 kilometers in the shoe. And their perceptions changed from, that kind of initial just bouncing around, running up and down, to actually running 1.5K. And to your point, so it's not necessarily always reflective of, how it's going to be out in the real world. So yeah, it's interesting. And then we did ask them to run at a slower speed and a faster speed. And the things that were related to comfort changed between those two speeds as well. So again, a shoe that might be comfortable for, a 60-minute easy run is not necessarily the same as, if you're going to do some 400 meters, sprint work, for example. So yeah, a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, because the mechanics change completely. So for listeners, your mechanics will change. Like everyone talks about, I'm a heel striker or a forward striker, a forefoot striker, whatever. That will generally change a little bit. Maybe some people it's very ingrained and they're forever the same, but for most people it will shift slightly differently. That will probably move more to a sort of more forefoot, midfoot strike as you speed up, and how you hit the shoe will be different. How that shoe interacts with you will be different. So all those things are relevant factors. The rocker point that you enjoy will be different in them all. So yeah, there's a lot of, I think it's going to get more confusing before it gets less confusing. But maybe to give the listeners something to finish on that I guess is useful that they can walk out the door with today, listen to the podcast, as a mixture of whatever you are, clinician, researcher, runner yourself, mother of a runner, at least to some degree. How would you select shoes, or how would you suggest selecting shoes?
Oh, I think just know that most of the time, people recommending shoes to you are people that are doing it as a weekend job. And most of the time it's because they're interested in shoes potentially themselves. It does help if they're runners, but if they are runners, they might also be biased by what's comfortable for them. And again, when we talk about that power of suggestibility, just be aware that, I hate going to shoe stores because I have people recommending me shoes and, like an 18-year-old kid telling me what shoes to wear and purposely going in asking for a more minimalist shoe and bringing me stuff that is not minimal because they're like, oh, so, are you looking to run distance or like short? And I was like, oh no, I'm more of a like longer distance runner. And then they wouldn't even bring me minimalist shoes because I was more of a distance runner. So I got really frustrated. But yeah, so I mean, I guess just be aware of that, and just make sure if you are getting recommendations, that you trust the person that you're getting recommendations from. And again, like you say, potentially a shoe that fits, that helps, a shoe that's wide enough, because often a lot of the shoes that we have are quite narrow. Here in New Zealand, they tend to be D width, which is good. So they tend to fit more people. But, we know that, footwear width, for example, people that wear too tight shoes a lot of the times, that actually what contributes to hallux valgus. And we talked about bunions earlier and things like that.
Yep.
A lot of people think it's genetics. Well, actually, it's probably just because you grew up wearing a lot of shoes that were too tight for you. So a shoe that fits, if you've used it before and it doesn't cause you injury, then that's probably a good guide.
Yeah,
but,
I would say so. So when I used to work special retail, I used to say my job is to help you with fit, but it needs to fit well, and that's the most important thing. Then we need to think about function. So what's like you're kind of on the treadmill, but more so, what are you using it for? Because that's a relevant factor. Then how does it feel to you? Like if it feels horrible, like we can't use it. And then the final F, which was much further down, was fashion. So the last F, so if it looks good, right? Once we're happy with two shoes or one shoe and we want to choose colors, we can do that, but try not to choose based on that. Although by the sounds of things, maybe it helps, but that's kind of how I think about it when I recommend things to people. But I'm the same as you. I go into shoe stores and just hate the experience for the most part.
And again, it depends where you are on the spectrum, right? Like, for my son, knowing that he's more of a barefoot kid and things like that, like, to me, less is more in that case.
Yep.
So do I want to put my 8-year-old son or 10-year-old son or 12-year-old son in a highly technical, restrictive shoe with pronation control and a heel? No, like I want him to be running if he can. And, barefoot is great, but, if it's just to protect from the outside environment, then I'd rather that he be wearing in something more minimalist for now. But he's not looking to compete. I know he's adapted to it. I know that his foot structures can take the load and his calf muscles can take the load. So again, I think there's a time and place for different individuals. So what shoe would you recommend? Again, it depends, So
and whatever shoe you choose, probably spend some time getting used to it. So don't use a shoe into the ground and then go buy a new one. It's kind of like, let's try and offset those. So you've probably got a 3 to 6 month period where you're sort of gradually wearing a shoe more and more, right? And you gradually wearing into it.
And I mean, I know there's only been like 1 or 2 research on it, but I personally kind of like the idea and believe that I in shoe rotation. Like, so I don't run in the same shoe 2 days in a row. I rotate between my different shoes. And so, yes, they're kind of similar and I tend to stick to the same models because they work well for me. But, there's also some variety in that rotation. And so I do kind of believe in that. So if people can afford to have more than one running shoe instead of running them into the ground and can rotate between shoes, I think it also makes sense from a shoe mechanical perspective. And in terms of, conditions and things like that, we know that, heat and humidity, for example, can influence the stiffness of shoes and they can influence, the flexibility and the energy return and things. So, so yeah, so it does kind of make sense to me.
Yeah, we had an episode, our 11th episode ever. So back in 2024 with a podiatrist who came on and talked about building out a shoe quiver. So like going from 1 shoe to 2 shoes, what should you consider? How do you do that? What about 3 shoes, 4 shoes? And I think there's a lot of value in the differences in that for different purposes, right? And then similarly to what you say, like the rotation of shoes to prevent, and surfaces if you can, and running routes, right? Don't run the same route every time. All those things to help with, less monotony, because there's, as you say, there is some research suggesting monotony is an injury risk factor. So variety is important. But Kim, this has been great. Really appreciate your time. I reserve the right to invite you back on when you publish your next paper or the next couple of papers. And anytime you want to come back on to talk research, please do, or shoes or whatever. We can talk running, anything you want. It's been great. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, no, likewise. I can't believe that it's already been almost an hour. So pleasure.
Yeah, it always flies. Thank you.
Really enjoyed that chat with Kim. It was different to what I expected. I don't know, when I hear associate professor, I always have a perception in my mind, but I really, really enjoyed her opinions.
Yeah, I thought it was good. Not scared of an opinion, which I think is great because, you come on a podcast to give opinions and thoughts. And I think sometimes we can be a little bit too pointing at the science and a bit too politically correct around some of the way we do science. I think it's important, particularly if you're her, to have an interpretation of the science and an opinion formed off the base of the literature, rather than just say, well, the literature says this. It's like, well, what do you think that means? Or how do you think you would apply that? It's great to have a take from her in that respect. So I really appreciated that part of it. And, we had a really good chat and, talked to, it's always a good sign when you talk off air for a long time afterwards. So I, share many of her biases towards things like, children being barefoot and that sort of stuff. But hopefully there's some stuff for people to realize there when they're buying shoes and certainly thinking about their strength work as runners there. I think there's a lot to take there. So appreciate Kim's time and hopefully listeners enjoyed that.
Well, thanks for putting that together. And if you enjoyed that, your subscription to this podcast, subscribing to the podcast really helps us get guests like this kind of caliber. So we really, really appreciate it. If you are listening and you haven't subscribed yet, please do so now. Do we have anyone in the doctor's office this week?
We have one in, one out, mate. So we'll start with the one out. So to make room. So we talked Letsile Tebogo a couple of weeks ago saying, he's got this injury and, at the Botswana Championships and we got World Relays coming up, we're worried about him. Yeah. Apparently he's fine. He came back. He's back. He ran the second fastest time of the year. He ran 44 something in the 400. So I think he's good for discharge from the doctor's office. He can go do his thing. He's unencumbered. But entering this, I got sent this by a physio I'm friends with, unrelated. I don't think she listens to the podcast. Maybe she does occasionally. She said, she sent me Sam Ruthe. So we haven't talked about Sam on the podcast, but he's another one of these teenage phenoms. So he's just turned 17 2 days ago at time of recording. And he is a Kiwi and he's run 3:33 for the 1500 meters and 3:48 for the mile and 1:45 for the 800 meters. He basically holds all the under 18 world records and those sort of things. Like this kid is unbelievable, this middle distance runner. And there's lots of talk about his training and how he does it. But I saw he's out for a little while with a fibular stress fracture. So the fibula, we have 2 bones in the lower leg, the shin. So there's the main shin bone, which is the tibia, B-I-A, T-I-B-I-A. And then there's the fibula. Sometimes people get this wrong and call it a fibia. So it's like tibia and fibia. It's not the case. It is fibula, F-I-B-U-L-A. Now, the interesting thing with the fibula is that it's a non-weight-bearing bone. So all of your body weight goes through your tibia, not the fibula. And so that's quite interesting because generally with running-related injuries, they are associated with load-bearing bones. But this is not the first one I've heard about that's associated. But interestingly, there is explicit mention in all the articles you read about this saying that this is not a running-related injury. And I think some of this is to do with commentary around how much he should or shouldn't be running given his age and the fact that people think he's going to get injured. Now, the very real situation is if you run enough, you will get injured, regardless of your age. And now certainly you're a little bit more robust to injury as we age and have accumulated more load tolerance. But it's a bit of a weird one. Like he said, it's more probably to do with lateral movement in football. I don't know how much football this kid's playing. Even if he's playing 2 games a week, you can't tell me the running doesn't have anything to do with this. So it may not be solely because of the running, but it's never solely to do with one thing. It's often to do with the running plus maybe a little bit of underfueling or some bad sleep or some stress or some travel or something else that's happened. So he may decide it's not running related and that's fine. Like I'm not convinced of that fact. Like I'd love to discuss that with whoever said it's not running related and understand why they said that because I'm open to being wrong here, but I'm not convinced.
Well, we wish Sam everything of the best with these fibia injury, stress fracture.
Mate, I'll fibia you in a second. You're telling fibs on the podcast, mate. That's what you're doing.
Letsile Tebogo. We talked about him last week when he was in the doctor's office.
But I just talked about him before. Remember I said there's one out, one in, and I said
I thought you were going to give
discharged.
more. Did you give more detail? You're just saying he's out. He's okay. I thought there was more detail you wanted to give. Okay. No. And then seen on social this week. Oh, I've been waiting for this. I don't know why this has taken so long. Your mate, you have a lot of opinions on Lionel Sanders. Seen on social is a feature we have where we look at content shared on social media that maybe at some point needs just some looking at and some more shifted in a more accurate direction. I don't know if that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, we're just trying to bring some context and some stuff. So great respect for Lionel as an athlete and the life he's led in many respects. Not the most academically inclined bloke, and certainly not somebody that I look to for the science, but he tries, and good on him. He's got a brand to uphold and a YouTube videos to get views on and all those things, and he plays the game well, and he's done really well for himself in that respect. But I think everybody saw this comment, and I think most people are expecting this part of the podcast for those who think about it. So he basically said, and again, I didn't go listen to this because I refused to go watch the content, but I did see the quote, is that apparently he doesn't produce lactate, and that he's similar to Christian Blumenfeld, I think, with respect to that. Some context here. Firstly, if he's similar to KB, Christian Blumenfeld, it's because they both train for the same event. So everybody who does Ironman looks relatively similar compared to everyone else in the population, right? But within that, you can look very different. And I would suggest that he doesn't look that similar to Christian within the Ironman population, but certainly in the fact that they're both elite Ironman athletes, yeah, sure. Okay, they look similar in that respect. What he's probably talking about there is what we start to see is what's called zonal compression. So if you take a random kid, and you look at where their threshold sits, you have two thresholds, a first and a second threshold, and then we can measure them with ventilation, and they call them ventilatory thresholds. We can use lactate, and they're called lactate thresholds. For the most people, and for the use in this case, let's just say they're the same thing. You have two thresholds, first and second, right? Doesn't matter how we measure them. As we train, particularly for endurance sports, what tends to happen is those thresholds move towards the high intensity stuff, right? So we don't have the ability, because we can become more efficient and our mitochondria become more efficient, we see less lactate. We don't produce less lactate, we see less lactate because the mitochondria uses it. And remember, what we see in the blood is a function of what's produced and what's used, right? So we become more and more efficient. We can exercise at higher intensities without accumulating lactate. So these thresholds end up bunching together and shifting towards the higher intensity, right? So closer to our maximal speed.
Yeah.
So we can sustain submaximal intensities for longer. That's the goal, right? That's what endurance training is. So as a percentage of our max, our second threshold moves closer to that, and our first threshold moves closer to that. And as a difference, they get closer together. So you can end up with a zone between them, right? If we're using a 3-zone model, then that's zone 2, not the zone 2 everyone talks about. That's a 5-zone model. But the zone between them can end up being very close together. And that's where we do most of our endurance events, marathons, Ironmans, etc. So it actually can be a little bit of an issue. So you may end up needing to do some top end work at some point, right? It becomes a particular issue if you never do any fast work, right? So back to this. So he's saying he can barely go anaerobic. What he's basically saying is I've got a good amount of zonal compression, right? Which is to say he's got a big zone 1, etc., right? Or a big below his first threshold. And that's where these guys will do a lot of their riding, which is still, he probably rides, and again, Tadej Pogačar has these numbers as well. It's probably 300 watts. And he's below his first threshold, whereas that's probably maximal for some other people, right? That's what makes them different. So anyway, there's that. And again, everybody produces lactate. It's just that it doesn't manifest in the blood necessarily because it is being used, right? What we see in the blood is what is accumulating. And the two thresholds, if we measure them via lactate, the first one comes when we start to see a rise from baseline in lactate, right? And the second one comes when it starts to accumulate sort of exponentially a little bit. Right. So that's how it is. So anyway, that's bringing some science to what Lionel said. It's not that he's necessarily wrong, but what he said is wrong, so to speak. Right. The way he expressed it is not quite right, but what he's saying is very interesting physiology that happens in all of us.
Oh, thanks for that context. That's really, really interesting. Let's get out of here. Before we do, what are we watching this weekend?
I'm in Texas, mate. So that's about that's basically a Kona quality field. It's going to have pretty much everyone that's in kind of
Unbelievable.
minus a couple. So that'll be unbelievable watching. Pity about time zones, but I'll make it work. And then Boston Marathon, mate. By the time we record again, the Boston Marathon will have happened. That is Monday. So good luck to everybody who's going there. I know we have a few people. I believe Christian Trumperdach is racing Boston. And I believe that Spencer Ladderbeck is. And I don't know who else in our listenership. Apologies if you are in our listenership and you aren't. If you are in our listenership, please do send us a DM. Because we'd like to track you, and more importantly, we want to talk about you when you've run the Boston Marathon. But enjoy it. Don't do too many shakeout runs. Don't eat too much Dunkin' Donuts. But enjoy Boston and all the things it's worth, and enjoy Marathon Monday.
I'll be watching Ironman South Africa this weekend, happening in my town. We've actually had regular listener and guest on the podcast, Matthew Marquardt, racing. So I'm really, really hoping that he will be winning it. Unfortunately, one of his bags didn't arrive. I think they sent it from Atlanta to Peru or something. So his cycling shoes aren't here. So he's been at my house to borrow cycling shoes and trainers. And he stopped by last night and stopped by on the bike this morning again. Great to see him again, hang out in person. So really, really hoping he wins the men's race.
It's surprising to me that you want him to win, because if he doesn't win, then almost certainly Jamie Riddle will win. You can tell a story about how you met Jamie Riddle's parents again at the Olympics.
Don't think I met them at the Olympics, did I? I know his dad very well. He lives in my town, so I go for coffee with his dad.
I mean, there you go. Enough. There you go.
Cool. Let's get out of here. This has been a big episode. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Subscribe to the podcast. Share it with a friend. Thank you so much for downloading and streaming. We drop a new episode every single Friday. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, mate. Talk soon.